I stood entirely frozen in the center of the grand lobby. My very first night shift had barely begun, yet my eyes were locked in absolute terror upon the polished marble floor. A long, unnaturally thin shadow was stretching outward from beneath the locked, heavy iron gate of the restricted servants' stairwell. It was the distinct, unmistakable silhouette of a remarkably tall figure, standing perfectly still in the dim light. But the corridor behind the iron bars was completely devoid of any physical presence. The shadow simply existed on its own, anchored to nothing, bleeding darkly into the warm ambient glow of the antique chandeliers. My respiratory system seemingly forgot how to function, a primal instinct screaming at my muscles to flee, but the anomaly simply dissolved into the marble the exact moment the senior night auditor approached me from behind to begin my orientation. I desperately needed to convince myself it was merely an optical illusion, a cruel trick played by exhaustion and anxiety. I had actively sought out this isolated, nocturnal position to escape the crushing, suffocating weight of my university studies. My academic workload had deteriorated my mental endurance, and I desperately needed a routine that offered the comforting embrace of profound, undisturbed isolation. The Delot Palace Heritage Hotel, nestled high in the freezing, mist-shrouded mountains of the Central Highlands, seemed like the perfect sanctuary. The graveyard shift promised minimal waking hours and virtually zero interaction with the living world outside the heavy revolving doors. The hotel itself is a magnificent, deeply imposing structure born of pure French colonial architecture. At a casual daylight glance, there is absolutely nothing about the elegant velvet drapery or the sweeping lawns that would ever scream of a malicious history. But the internal, structural layout of the building possessed a very strange, almost oppressive architectural anomaly. The grand mahogany reception desk where I was stationed sat directly beneath a completely sealed, heavily reinforced section of the upper floors. It was a massive historical ballroom and a connecting series of adjacent storage vaults that had been permanently closed off to the public for several decades. The modern elevators were programmed to bypass that specific floor entirely. The only physical route into that forgotten space was that narrow, windowless servant's staircase tucked away behind the iron security gate, the exact gate where I had just witnessed the impossible shadow. The senior auditor, noticing my pale and visibly shaken expression, did not offer any words of comfort. Instead, he casually began to dismantle any fragile illusion of safety I had left. He slowly started sharing the true, unvarnished history of the establishment, detailing a highly specific, recurring tragedy the hotel faced during a much darker period in the city's history. During a time of severe medical scarcity, that sealed upper floor had been quietly converted into a makeshift quarantine ward, a desperate place where afflicted individuals were sent to be entirely isolated. Several people had ultimately perished in those locked rooms, completely cut off from the world. Trapped directly above the ornate ceiling of the lobby, as the midnight hours stretched on, the atmosphere inside the lobby began to subtly, maliciously alter. I started noticing the unsettling signs the senior auditor warned me about. The ambient temperature would plummet drastically in highly localized pockets of air, leaving my hands numb while my face remained warm. The heavy, crystal chandeliers hanging from the high ceiling would begin to sway in a slow, rhythmic pendulum motion, despite the fact that all doors and windows were completely sealed against the mountain mist. I found myself compulsively avoiding looking into the tall, silver-backed mirrors lining the corridor, because every time I caught my own reflection, My movements seemed to lag, a terrifying fraction of a second behind reality. The senior auditor observed my escalating paranoia and carefully explained that the residual energy of the building did not always manifest as a visual trick. He described a sudden, violent shift in the atmospheric pressure directly above the reception area. He explained that the air itself would occasionally become impossibly dense and unbreathable. A deep, concussive physical weight would drop from the ceiling above, a catastrophic settling of unseen mass that vibrated heavily through the floorboards, an invisible impact mirroring the tragic history trapped on the floor above. That was the precise moment he decided to share the fate of the previous night clerk, the very individual I was hired to replace. He detailed how that young man had been instructed to retrieve a specific set of archival guest registries from the locked storage vault on that sealed upper floor. The young clerk took the heavy brass key and ascended the narrow, winding servant's staircase entirely alone. He was only supposed to be gone for a brief, fleeting moment. Instead, the housekeeping staff working the lower levels noticed a frantic commotion echoing from the staff corridors. They witnessed the young man throw his entire body weight desperately against the heavy iron gate. When they finally unlocked it, he collapsed onto the cold marble floor, hyperventilating and weeping uncontrollably. Once they managed to extract a coherent statement from him, his explanation was chillingly precise. He stated that while searching the dust-covered storage vault, he felt an intense, suffocating drop in the room's air pressure. He noticed that the dark, elongated shadows cast by the tarp-covered antique furniture were physically detaching from their corresponding objects, stretching and pulling themselves slowly across the floorboards toward him. He looked into a large, freestanding Victorian mirror leaning against the far wall, expecting to see his own nervous expression staring back. He quickly realized that the reflection trapped in the glass completely failed to reflect his physical body. He possessed no shadow, no presence in the glass whatsoever. However, standing exactly where his reflection should have been was a tall, impossibly still silhouette woven entirely out of absolute darkness, peering out from the confines of the mirror as if intently studying his physical form. When he finally gathered the paralyzing courage to turn his head and look at the physical space right beside him, the room was entirely empty. But the overwhelming, magnetic sensation of a predatory presence standing mere inches from his face forced his survival instincts to take over. He fled the upper floor and submitted his resignation before the sun managed to rise. By the time the senior auditor finished his terrifying account, he announced he had to perform his mandatory perimeter patrol of the exterior grounds. He handed me the heavy brass key to the iron gate, instructed me to watch the desk, and walked out into the freezing fog, leaving me completely and utterly alone in the cavernous lobby. The silence of the sprawling hotel was no longer peaceful. It was expectant, heavy, and deeply malicious. I stood perfectly still, my eyes darting between the swaying chandeliers and the locked iron gate in the distance. Then, without any preliminary warning whatsoever, the air inside the lobby became impossibly thick. The oxygen was violently pushed out of the room. My eardrums throbbed against an immense, crushing shift in the atmospheric pressure. I looked up at the ornate plaster ceiling directly above my head, and I could feel the invisible, devastating mass of something ancient and sorrowful settling heavily into the floorboards just inches above me. The vibration of the unseen impact rattled through the soles of my shoes. The deep, impenetrable darkness of the Delat night pressed heavily against the glass doors. The isolation I had so desperately craved was now a meticulously designed, inescapable trap. I carefully placed the brass key in the exact center of the mahogany desk. I did not wait for the air pressure to normalize. I did not wait for the senior auditor to return. I simply turned my back on the grand staircase, walked out through the revolving doors into the welcoming, freezing mountain mist. And I never returned to collect my final paycheck. I still find myself waking up at precisely 3 in the morning, my eyes immediately tracing the dark, impenetrable corners of my bedroom, waiting for a shadow to detach itself from the gloom. It is a permanent psychological scar, a lingering residue from a single, catastrophic night that fundamentally shattered my perception of reality. If you have ever traveled through the mist-choked peaks of the Appalachian Mountains in North Carolina, you are likely familiar with the winding, treacherous roads of the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is the main artery leading toward the city of Asheville, a beautiful but deeply isolating stretch of highway, flanked by ancient, towering pine forests. And hidden entirely within those dense trees, sitting atop a lonely, elevated ridge, is the infamous abandoned Victorian mountain estate. It has always been one of those notorious locations you simply cannot avoid hearing about if you spend any amount of time in the region. The architectural decay is visible from the road, a looming, decaying silhouette of dark stone and shattered glass that seems to absorb the surrounding fog. The local lore surrounding the property has been circulating and evolving for decades. There are persistent rumors of unmarked graves buried deep beneath the overgrown pine needles in the backyard, remnants of a brutal and unforgiving Gilded Age era. Passing drivers report their headlights catching the impossible shapes of figures standing motionless on the upper balconies, entirely unresponsive to the freezing mountain winds. Paranormal enthusiasts have documented sudden, devastating drops in the ambient temperature that drain camera batteries in seconds, and captured visual distortions in the grand, decaying entryway that cannot be logically explained by the shifting moonlight. As for myself, I had always existed firmly in the realm of comfortable skepticism. I did not entirely dismiss the concept of the supernatural, but I certainly did not respect it. I possessed a deep fascination with the macabre and the abandoned. I explored decaying hospitals and forgotten temples purely for the adrenaline and the aesthetic. I had intentionally slept in historically haunted hotel rooms across the country, treating the lingering atmospheres as nothing more than an immersive, entertaining experience. I always rationalized every cold draft, every creaking floorboard, and every fleeting shadow as the predictable byproduct of an overactive imagination fueled by environmental suggestion. Even when the historical accounts were deeply disturbing, I maintained my emotional distance, treating the spiritual world as a fascinating psychological phenomenon. I was incredibly arrogant and completely unprepared for the reality of what happens when that unseen world decides to acknowledge you back. The dismantling of my skepticism occurred during my late teens. I was a university student residing in Asheville, and a small, tightly knit group of friends and I had spent the entire evening in the downtown center. The night had stretched endlessly into the early hours of the morning, and the mountain fog had descended heavily, reducing visibility to mere feet. We were riding our motorcycles back down the winding descent of the Blue Ridge Parkway, surrounded by absolute, suffocating darkness, when we collectively, and foolishly, decided to pull over at the base of the ridge leading up to the abandoned Victorian estate. The property simply sat there in the freezing mist, empty, looming, and completely devoid of any light or life. We left our vehicles by the roadside and drifted slowly up the overgrown dirt path, our shoes crunching softly against the thick layer of damp pine needles. We were whispering amongst ourselves, displaying a forced, nervous energy, peering into the shattered windows, trying the heavy, rusted handles of the exterior doors, circling the perimeter of the decaying structure like scavengers looking for a weakness in the architecture. Our primary concern was the possibility of a local security patrol, or perhaps vagrants sheltering inside the ruined rooms. The concept of a supernatural threat was the furthest thing from our minds. We were still engaging in that careless, juvenile behavior where one person attempts to frighten another by hiding in the shadows, laughing away the tension even when the amusement felt entirely hollow and desperate. Then, we slowly congregated near the grand front entrance, specifically near a large, arched window immediately to the right of the heavy, chained wooden doors. I stepped forward and leaned my face close to the cracked, grime-covered glass, expecting to see nothing beyond the absolute darkness of an abandoned, decaying foyer, expecting to find discarded debris or the rotting remains of antique furniture. But instead, I saw a massive, elongated shadow move with impossible, fluid speed across the interior space. It cut directly through the center of the dark room, moving in a trajectory that forced my eyes to lock onto it automatically. My very first, desperate rationalization was that I was simply observing my own silhouette reflecting back at me from a remaining shard of glass. A stupid, predictable optical illusion caused by the faint moonlight filtering through the fog behind us. But the horrifying realization of my error arrived a fraction of a second later, the exact moment my brain processed the unnatural, gliding movement. I was physically struck by a wave of pure, unadulterated terror, so sharp and immediate that my central nervous system reacted long before my conscious mind could comprehend the danger. I jerked violently backward, away from the window, as if the glass itself had suddenly turned to molten fire. My stomach plummeted. A freezing, agonizing chill radiated outward from my spine, paralyzing my limbs. The sensation that violently flooded my body was not a vague, generalized feeling of unease. It was not the simple recognition that the abandoned house was creepy. It was the absolute, undeniable, and crushing certainty that something ancient and deeply malevolent inside that dark room had just noticed me looking in. It felt as though the physical barrier of the glass and the stone walls had completely evaporated. It felt as though this unseen entity was standing mere inches from my face, examining me with a cold, calculating, and utterly hostile intelligence. I did not see a face. I did not hear a single sound emanating from the darkness, and nothing physically reached through the shattered window to grab me. But the unseen gaze pressing against my mind was neither curious nor territorial. It was incredibly, profoundly hungry. Whatever was standing in the shadows of that abandoned foyer desperately wanted me to step over the threshold. It wanted to drag me into the dark and subject me to unspeakable, unimaginable horrors. Of that fact, I possessed absolute, terrifying clarity. I had never been a religious individual, and I had never entertained the concept of demonic entities. But the only word that my paralyzed mind could associate with the crushing pressure radiating from that room was pure, unadulterated evil. I continued to step backward, my respiration rapid and shallow, desperately attempting to mask the sheer magnitude of my panic from my friends, relying on that foolish, teenage bravado to maintain my composure. But the true horror of the encounter had already begun to infect the rest of the group. Out in the overgrown courtyard, just a few feet away from the grand entrance, one of the young women in our group began to weep. She was not crying out of a sudden fright or a juvenile prank. Her body had violently shifted into a state of severe physiological shock entirely against her will. Only moments prior, she had been a willing participant in the exploration, smiling and navigating the darkness alongside the rest of us. Now, she was trembling uncontrollably, her knees buckling as she sobbed into her hands, gesturing frantically and demanding that we abandon the property immediately. Her companion had to physically support her weight, half dragging her away from the estate and back down the steep dirt path toward the safety of the main road. The rest of us followed in stunned silence, the atmosphere of the night having instantly shifted from an adventurous thrill to a desperate fight for survival. The others attempted to minimize the situation, offering empty reassurances and projecting a false sense of bravery, claiming that the environment was merely unsettling and not truly dangerous. We congregated near the motorcycles, attempting to console her, offering apologies as though our actions had been the catalyst for her sudden breakdown. But she refused to acknowledge our comfort, and she completely refused to turn her body back toward the looming silhouette of the Victorian estate. She simply kept her back to the mountain, pointing a trembling finger over her shoulder toward the decaying structure, crying harder with every passing second. After that catastrophic night, the psychological torment only intensified. For the next several weeks, I found myself completely incapable of achieving a restful state of sleep. I would be violently pulled from unconsciousness at precisely 3 a.m, snapping awake as though an invisible hand had aggressively ripped me from my dreams. I would lie completely paralyzed in the suffocating darkness of my own room, desperately attempting to convince my rational mind that the heavy, deliberate shifting I felt in the hallway outside my door was merely the natural settling of the architecture. On several agonizing occasions, I could sense a distinct, rhythmic displacement of air inside my own bedroom, a slow, dragging sensation, as though something of immense weight was pacing the perimeter of my bed. I would force myself to sit upright, straining my senses until my ears rang with the oppressive silence, staring blindly into the absolute blackness of the corners, waiting for the shadow from the estate to finally reveal itself. Eventually, my friends and I cautiously breached the subject during the daylight hours, comparing our declining mental states and exchanging careful, hesitant observations. We were attempting to utilize humor to mask the profound reality that we were all terrified to be left alone in the dark. The deeply unsettling revelation was that every single individual present at the estate that night was enduring the exact same psychological torment. We were all experiencing the sudden, synchronized nocturnal awakenings, the identical sensation of a heavy, invisible presence standing just beyond the threshold of our vision, close enough to project its malice, but refusing to materialize. A skeptic could easily argue that our collective imaginations were simply feeding off the intense emotional trauma of that specific night, a shared psychological hysteria manifesting as physical symptoms. But it is incredibly difficult to dismiss the sheer terror of multiple individuals simultaneously experiencing the exact same predatory presence in completely separate locations. The suffocating nocturnal visits eventually ceased their relentless pattern, slowly fading back into the mundane reality of daily life. But the psychological damage was permanent. Years have passed, yet whenever my travels force me to navigate the winding roads of the Blue Ridge Parkway, The mere sight of that decaying dark stone rising above the pine trees causes my skin to crawl and my chest to tighten. I had always confidently assumed that the tragic folklore and the ghost tours were nothing more than exaggerated fabrications designed to entertain the gullible. But the reality of the unseen world is far more terrifying than any local legend. There is something ancient and deeply hostile residing within the walls of that abandoned estate. And I, for one, have absolutely no desire to ever discover what it truly is. I have dedicated a significant portion of my adult life to building a meticulously curated archive of the unknown, seeking out undocumented territories and forgotten architecture scattered across the more isolated regions of the globe. I actively pursued the obscure and the abandoned, constantly hunting for locations that possessed a profound sense of genuine dread, a tangible atmosphere that could not be easily explained or categorized by modern science. My obsession with documenting these forgotten spaces usually led to fascinating, tangible discoveries. Abandoned military outposts, decaying aristocratic manors, crumbling industrial complexes left to rot by the passage of time. But there is one specific expedition that completely shattered my understanding of the physical world. An experience I have attempted to rationalize for years, only to fail every single time. It occurred during a heavily overcast November several years ago. A colleague and I were navigating the deepest, most unforgiving stretch of the Black Forest in southwestern Germany. We were attempting to trace an old, undocumented route branching off from the Schwarzwald-Hochstrasse, the high forest highway. Our progress was painfully slow. The autumn mist in that specific region does not merely roll in, it completely swallows the landscape, erasing the towering pine trees and turning the winding asphalt into a terrifying, featureless gray void. The environmental conditions became so entirely hazardous that continuing our journey felt like a profound physical risk. We were forced to pull our vehicle off the main highway, creeping blindly down an unmarked, unpaved logging trail simply to escape the threat of oncoming traffic. We navigated the uneven dirt path for what felt like an eternity, completely detached from civilization, until the dense tree line suddenly, unnaturally broke, revealing a massive, decaying structure sitting silently in a forgotten clearing. It was a colossal, multi-story hunting lodge and way station, constructed of heavy, dark timber and mountain stone. It possessed the distinct, imposing architecture of the late 19th century, but it was entirely surrendered to the elements. The intricate wooden balconies were sagging under the weight of decades of rot. The massive slate roof was partially collapsed, and the surrounding forest had aggressively begun to reclaim the foundation. It was a magnificent, terrifying discovery, a completely uncharted monument to a forgotten era, and the perfect subject for our ongoing archival project. We abandoned the safety of the vehicle, grabbing our equipment and approaching the looming facade with a mixture of professional excitement and deep instinctual caution. The sheer scale of the abandonment was breathtaking. There were no modern tire tracks in the mud, no discarded debris or graffiti. It was as if humanity had collectively forgotten this structure existed a century ago. We breached the heavy, unlocked oak doors and stepped into the main foyer. The interior was suffocatingly dark and incredibly stagnant. The air inside felt heavy, ancient, and completely untouched by the freezing mountain wind howling outside. We moved slowly through the desolate corridors, our flashlights cutting through the thick, suspended dust, documenting the peeling wallpaper and the rotting remnants of antique furniture. The atmosphere was profoundly unsettling, but it aligned perfectly with the aesthetic of decay we had spent years seeking out. However, that comfortable, predictable silence was violently shattered the exact moment we crossed the threshold into what must have been the grand dining hall. The physical reality of the space simply collapsed the moment we stepped inside. We did not experience the stereotypical theatrical manifestations of a haunting. We did not witness translucent figures floating in the corners, or hear the dramatic, echoing whispers of the dead. The horror we encountered was entirely, terrifyingly physical. The absolute, immediate second we entered the center of the massive room, the atmospheric pressure compressed so violently that my eardrums throbbed with agonizing pain. The stagnant, freezing air suddenly became blisteringly hot, suffocatingly thick and heavy, with the distinct, undeniable humidity of 100 unseen bodies breathing simultaneously in a confined space. The heavy, rotting floorboards beneath our boots began to rhythmically bow and vibrate with immense, catastrophic force. It was not the gentle settling of an old house. It was the frantic, concussive weight of a massive, desperate crowd rushing blindly around us. The entire structural integrity of the room was shaking, bending under the pressure of a chaotic gathering that we simply could not see. I stood completely paralyzed, struggling to draw oxygen into my burning lungs, watching the thick layers of undisturbed dust on the floor suddenly violently swirl and scatter, perfectly tracing the invisible footprints of heavy boots and trailing garments rushing frantically past us. Then, the unseen reality made physical contact. My colleague was violently shoved backward, his heavy camera equipment striking his chest as an immense, invisible mass collided directly with his shoulder. I felt the distinct, rushing displacement of air brush aggressively against my face, followed by the sharp, stinging impact of an invisible elbow driving deep into my ribs. We were completely engulfed in a phantom stampede, caught in the chaotic epicenter of an unseen tragedy or a desperate evacuation that was playing itself out on a terrifying, repeating loop. The sheer, overwhelming panic radiating from the invisible crowd was contagious, entirely overriding my rational mind and flooding my nervous system with pure, unadulterated terror. We did not attempt to investigate further. We abandoned all professional curiosity and simply fled, pushing our way through the invisible, suffocating crush of bodies, sprinting blindly through the dark corridors until we burst through the main doors and collapsed into the freezing mountain fog. We threw ourselves into the vehicle, tearing out of the clearing and blindly navigating the dangerous logging road until we finally reached the paved safety of the main highway. It took us several hours of driving in absolute, stunned silence before our heart rates normalized enough to even begin processing the trauma of the encounter. But the true, enduring horror of that expedition did not fully materialize until we returned to our office in Munich several weeks later. I became completely obsessed with researching the history of the lodge, determined to uncover the tragic event that had permanently scarred the atmosphere of that building. I meticulously cross-referenced our GPS coordinates with historical land registries, regional architectural archives, and highly detailed modern satellite imagery of the Black Forest. Absolutely nothing existed in that location. There was no record of a hunting lodge, no documentation of a way station, and no historical foundation ever registered on that specific ridge. According to the official topography, the area we had explored was nothing more than an unbroken sea of ancient pine trees. Convinced that there was a massive error in the public records, my colleague and I returned to the Black Forest exactly 1 year later. Equipped with exact coordinates and a desperate need for validation, we navigated the same highway, located the exact same unmarked logging trail, and drove deep into the misty woods. We followed the path to its absolute conclusion, but the clearing was gone. The massive, decaying structure, the rotting balconies, the heavy oak doors, everything had completely vanished. In its place, the dirt path simply terminated at the very edge of a sheer, devastatingly steep cliff face that dropped hundreds of feet into a rocky ravine below. The terrain made it physically impossible for any structure to have ever been built there, let alone a colossal, multi-story lodge. We stood at the edge of the precipice, staring out into the freezing gray mist, slowly realizing the horrifying truth. We had not simply stepped into an abandoned building. We had briefly, accidentally, walked into a pocket of reality that did not belong to our world. A place completely detached from the linear flow of time and space. I still actively maintain my archive of the unknown, but I no longer seek out the deep isolation of the forest, because I now possess the terrifying knowledge that some forgotten places do not simply decay. They disappear entirely, taking their unseen horrors with them, waiting patiently for the next lost traveler to wander off the path. The overwhelming desire for absolute isolation is a deeply dangerous pursuit. It is a romanticized concept that we often crave when the suffocating weight of modern life becomes too heavy to bear. But we rarely consider what might be waiting for us when we finally strip away the protective noise of civilization. Two of my closest colleagues and I had reached a point of profound professional and psychological burnout. We desperately required a sanctuary, a place entirely disconnected from the relentless demands of our careers. We scoured various online rental platforms, bypassing the populated tourist destinations and actively seeking out the most remote, unforgiving landscapes we could find. We ultimately secured a short-term lease on an isolated, beautifully restored 17th century fisherman's cottage. It was violently clinging to the very edge of a jagged, wind-swept cliff in the deepest, most desolate region of Cornwall, England. The promotional photographs displayed a charming, rustic aesthetic, thick stone walls, heavy exposed timber beams, and a panoramic, uninterrupted view of the violent, churning gray ocean below. It appeared to be the perfect, picturesque retreat, a silent fortress where we could simply exist without expectation. But photographs cannot capture the atmospheric density of a location. They cannot convey the heavy, ancient stagnation that settles into the foundation of a building that has endured centuries of isolation and unforgiving coastal storms. We arrived late in the evening, navigating a treacherous, unpaved coastal road that felt less like a driveway and more like a descent into the edge of the world. The cottage was surrounded by miles of empty, dying moors on one side and a lethal drop into the black water on the other. The sheer physical isolation of the property was immediately, undeniably oppressive. The interior architecture of the cottage was beautifully modernized, but the original, skeletal framework of the 17th century remained entirely intact. The ground floor consisted of a massive, open-plan living space, while the upper floor was divided into 3 distinct bedrooms, connected by a remarkably narrow, suffocatingly tight hallway. The initial signs of the architectural anomaly began on the very first night, manifesting in ways that were incredibly easy to dismiss as the natural quirks of an ancient settling structure. We had all retired to our respective bedrooms, firmly shutting the heavy, solid oak doors against the freezing drafts bleeding in from the window frames. I am a notoriously light sleeper, constantly hyper-aware of my immediate surroundings. Sometime deep in the absolute dead of night, I felt a sudden, freezing drop in the ambient temperature of my room, a sudden rush of displaced air brushing against my face, as if a physical body had just moved rapidly past my bed. I sat upright in the suffocating darkness, staring toward the entrance of my room. The heavy oak door, which I had physically latched shut hours prior, was now standing entirely open, exposing the pitch-black void of the narrow hallway. My immediate rational assumption was that the latch was simply faulty, or that the intense, unrelenting coastal wind battering the stone exterior had somehow manipulated the air pressure inside the cottage, forcing the heavy wood to swing on its hinges. I left my bed, firmly secured the door once again, and buried myself beneath the heavy blankets, aggressively forcing my mind to accept the logical explanation. But the following morning, over a tense, quiet breakfast, we discovered that every single internal door on the upper floor had been found wide open upon waking. We engaged in the typical nervous rationalizations, blaming the historic architecture, the uneven floorboards, and the violent ocean drafts. We collectively agreed to ignore the underlying dread that was slowly beginning to pool in our stomachs, choosing instead to focus on the rugged beauty of the Cornish coastline. The true, undeniable escalation occurred during our second night, completely destroying any fragile illusions of safety we had managed to construct. The sun had descended hours ago, plunging the cottage into an impenetrable darkness. We were gathered in the main living space on the ground floor, attempting to unwind, when the electrical system began to behave with deliberate, calculating malice. It did not simply flicker or fail as one might expect in a rural location. Instead, the heavy wrought iron light fixtures illuminating the ground floor began to systematically extinguish themselves, completely sequentially, starting from the furthest corner of the kitchen and slowly, methodically, moving toward the exact center of the room where we were seated. It was a deliberate manipulation of the environment, an intelligent, progressive encroachment of absolute blackness that physically forced us to retreat toward the staircase. As we stood huddled at the base of the wooden stairs, engulfed in the sudden dark, the heavy physical reality of the haunting manifested. We felt a deep, concussive vibration strike the thick wooden planks of the ceiling directly above our heads. It was not a subtle shifting of the house. It was the unmistakable, rhythmic displacement of immense physical weight pressing heavily into the floorboards of the upper hallway. We stood entirely paralyzed, our respiratory systems completely frozen, tracking the invisible concussive pressure as it slowly, deliberately paced the length of the narrow corridor above us. The sheer mass required to bend the ancient timber to that degree was terrifying, and the agonizingly slow, calculated rhythm of the movement possessed an undeniable, predatory intelligence. Whatever was occupying the upper floor was entirely aware of our presence below, and it was taking its time, establishing absolute dominance over the physical space. The psychological torment of knowing that an unseen, massive entity was actively patrolling the only route to our belongings and our bedrooms was debilitating. We remained trapped at the bottom of the staircase for hours, huddled together in the freezing dark, entirely unwilling to ascend the steps and confront the suffocating weight moving above us. Eventually, as the deep hours of the morning approached, the oppressive vibrations ceased. The atmosphere suddenly lightened, the crushing density of the air evaporating as if a physical valve had been released. We foolishly convinced ourselves that the anomaly had passed. We cautiously ascended the staircase, moving as a single, terrified unit, and retreated into one shared bedroom, locking the heavy oak door and dragging a massive antique dresser across the threshold for physical security. We huddled together, fully clothed, waiting desperately for the sanctuary of the morning light. But the entity was not finished with us. It had merely been waiting for us to confine ourselves. Precisely as my exhausted mind began to drift toward unconsciousness, the temperature inside the locked bedroom plummeted so violently that I could physically see the moisture of my own breath crystallizing in the dark. The heavy, rhythmic vibrations returned, but this time they were not in the hallway. They were originating from the exact center of our locked, barricaded room. The wooden floorboards bowed deeply under the invisible weight, compressing the space mere inches from the foot of the bed. I could feel the mattress physically tilt as the immense mass shifted its position. But the most catastrophic element of the encounter, the detail that fundamentally broke my understanding of reality, was the sudden, overwhelming manipulation of the air pressure directly beside my ear. I did not hear a voice in the traditional sense. I did not hear words or recognizable language. Instead, I felt the violent, localized vibration of vocal cords physically displacing the air mere millimeters from my face. It was the agonizing physical sensation of a massive, unseen lung forcefully exhaling a breath of freezing, stagnant air directly into my ear canal, followed immediately by a deep, guttural vibration that violently rattled my eardrums and radiated straight down my spine. It was a projection of pure, unadulterated hostility, an unseen intelligent force invading the most intimate physical space imaginable, intentionally projecting its malice directly into my nervous system. The sheer magnitude of the terror was entirely paralyzing. My colleagues were experiencing the exact same physiological shock, their bodies completely rigid beside me in the dark. None of us daring to move, none of us daring to draw a breath, trapped in the agonizing certainty that if we acknowledged the unseen entity hovering over us, it would physically tear us apart. We remained frozen in that state of absolute agonizing dread until the very first faint rays of gray sunlight finally began to bleed through the edges of the window blinds. The exact moment the physical environment grew bright enough to reveal the empty corners of the room, the crushing pressure instantly vanished. We did not speak a single word to one another. There was no discussion, no attempt to rationalize the horrors of the night. We simply shoved the heavy dresser away from the door, abandoned the vast majority of our belongings in the closets, and fled the cottage with nothing but our vehicle keys and the clothes we had slept in. We left the front door wide open to the violent coastal winds, tearing out of the unpaved driveway and aggressively navigating the treacherous cliffside road, desperate to put as much physical distance between ourselves and that ancient stone structure as humanly possible. We drove for hundreds of miles before anyone finally found the courage to break the suffocating silence. The idyllic concept of isolating oneself in a remote, historic location has entirely lost its romantic appeal for me. I am now permanently, terrifyingly aware that some structures retain the dark, stagnant history of their environments, and that true isolation does not guarantee peace. Sometimes, stepping away from the populated world simply makes you an incredibly easy target for the unseen things that have been waiting patiently in the dark for a very, very long time. It is a common misconception that darkness is the only veil for malevolent forces, that the boundary between the living and the dead only fractures when the sun finally sets. But the most ruthless truth I have ever been forced to confront is that absolute terror can easily find you in the middle of the afternoon, in a locked room, while you are completely and entirely awake. Several years ago, I was enduring an exhausting, extended business trip down the east coast of the United States. The relentless schedule had entirely depleted my physical and mental reserves, prompting me to grant myself 2 days of absolute silence in the historic city of Savannah, Georgia, a region famous for its ancient weeping oaks and deeply saturated Gothic architecture. I deliberately avoided the sterile, predictable environment of modern hotel chains. The isolation and melancholy of historic architecture always possessed a strange, magnetic pull for me. I secured a room in a sprawling 3-story antebellum mansion, tucked away on a quiet, shaded street near Forsyth Park. The proprietor assigned me a massive room at the very end of the second-floor corridor, dominated by dark mahogany furniture and an imposing 4-poster bed. The bed was heavily dressed with thick, suffocating layers of quilts, a traditional arrangement meant for freezing winter nights, but one that created a physical weight that aggressively pulled you into a deep slumber. On the afternoon of my second day, the suffocating heat and oppressive humidity characteristic of the American South had left me feeling entirely drained. I decided to retreat to my room early to simply rest my eyes. Every window was tightly sealed, the heavy, plum-colored velvet curtains drawn completely shut, blocking out the blinding glare of the afternoon sun. The room was submerged in a dim, melancholic, and profound silence. I carefully engaged the heavy brass deadbolt, shed my outer layers of clothing, and climbed onto the high mattress, pulling the heavy quilt up to my chest. My body completely relaxed, my mind beginning to drift into that fragile, liminal space between waking and sleeping. I was entirely aware of my physical orientation, aware of the thin sliver of daylight bleeding through the curtains, and absolutely certain of the undeniable fact that I was completely alone in a room locked from the inside. And then, the sequence of events that permanently shattered my understanding of reality began. It started as a microscopic, almost imperceptible physical shift. I felt the mattress at the very foot of the bed, inches from my heels, slowly depress. It was not the natural settling of old, fatigued springs. It possessed a deliberate, calculating weight, exactly as if a physical entity had just slowly, carefully rested its mass on the edge of the mattress. I did not open my eyes. My mind desperately clung to the silence, attempting to convince myself that it was merely a sensory hallucination born of severe exhaustion. But then, a second pressure manifested. This one was distinct, razor sharp, and unbelievably cold. Directly beneath the heavy layers of the quilt, I felt a physical contact slowly press against my right calf. It was not a sudden draft of cold air, or an involuntary muscle spasm. It was the undeniable, perfect physical shape of the human hand. I was instantly, completely paralyzed. The blood in my veins felt as though it had turned to ice. 5 distinct, separate points of pressure, perfectly mirroring the anatomy of fingertips, began to press firmly through the fabric of my trousers. The touch carried a freezing, biting chill that pierced directly through the heavy layers of bedding, sinking straight into my skin. And then, that unseen, freezing hand began to move. The 5 fingers were not hurried. They began to drag, a slow, rhythmic, and deeply malicious motion, dragging upward from my ankle, slowly creeping toward my knee. The movement was so incredibly vivid that I could clearly feel the invisible joints flexing, could feel the agonizing friction of phantom fingernails ruthlessly pressing into my flesh. My windpipe constricted completely. I was physically incapable of producing a single sound. My brain was screaming in pure panic, but my motor functions had entirely shut down. The absolute apex of my terror did not stem from seeing a ghostly apparition, but from the utterly helpless realization that a non-human entity was physically violating my personal space while I was entirely conscious. The hand continued its agonizing crawl upward, slipping over the fold of my knee. The movement carried a sickening curiosity, a morbid, predatory desire to explore. The weight pressing into the mattress shifted with every agonizing inch it gained, proving with terrifying, absolute certainty that whatever was sharing the space beneath the covers possessed a distinct physical mass. I knew with absolute clarity that if that freezing hand moved even a fraction of an inch higher, my mind would completely and irreparably fracture. Through a monumental, desperate surge of primal survival instinct, I clamped my jaw shut, channeled every remaining ounce of adrenaline into my arms, and violently threw the heavy quilt toward the foot of the bed, simultaneously throwing my body sideways and crashing onto the hard wooden floor. I spun around instantly, pressing my back flat against the cold plaster wall, my chest heaving violently, my eyes locked in pure, unadulterated terror upon the bed. There was absolutely nothing there. The heavy quilt lay crumpled at the foot of the mattress. The bedsheets were perfectly flat and entirely empty. There were no unnatural depressions in the mattress, no shadows lurking beneath the bed frame. The entire room was drowned in a suffocating, dead silence. The heavy wooden door remained completely secured, the brass deadbolt perfectly engaged. The physical space was entirely empty, yet the atmosphere was incredibly thick with a sense of dark amusement. I could feel it, with absolute, terrifying clarity, that the entity which had just touched me had not left the room. It was simply standing there, dissolved into the dim shadows of the corners, silently reveling in the sheer magnitude of my panic. I did not hesitate for a single second to gather my belongings. I bolted for the door, sprinting frantically down the carpeted corridor, throwing myself down the grand wooden staircase, and bursting out through the front entrance, embracing the blinding, suffocating heat of the savannah afternoon like a drowning man breaking the surface of the water. I booked the earliest possible flight out of Georgia that exact same evening, abandoning my luggage, my clothing, and all my personal effects inside that locked room. Years have passed since that afternoon, but every single time I lie down, if a fold of the blanket accidentally brushes against my leg, the absolute terror of that day aggressively resurrects itself. That single encounter permanently stripped away my most basic sense of safety, because I now understand that the things belonging to the unseen world do not need to wait for midnight to hunt you. They are always there, even in the blinding sunlight. And most terrifyingly of all, they are right there beneath your covers. There is a profound, inherent danger in intentionally seeking out the untouched remnants of the past. We often romanticize historic architecture, entirely forgetting that buildings constructed centuries ago have absorbed generations of human suffering, and some of those structures simply refuse to let that suffering dissipate into the atmosphere. Late last autumn, my sister finalized the arrangements for a family retreat to the Oregon coast. She had specifically bypassed the modern, sterile resorts, intentionally booking a suite at one of the oldest, most imposing Victorian hotels in the historic district of Astoria. She wanted us to experience the authentic, maritime gloom of the Pacific Northwest, completely unaware that the suffocating atmosphere of the building would manifest the exact moment we crossed the threshold. The hotel was an architectural relic, a towering structure of dark, weathered wood and narrow, suffocating corridors that smelled faintly of salt and decaying antique fabric. The ambient lighting in the hallways was incredibly dim, casting elongated, unnatural shadows against the peeling floral wallpaper. Our suite was located at the very end of the third floor, isolated and incredibly stagnant. When we finally unlocked the heavy wooden door, the interior felt immediately aggressively outdated. The floorboards sagged under our weight, and the sheer density of the air in the room made drawing a full breath feel like a conscious, exhausting effort. There were 3 heavy, antique beds arranged in the center of the room, facing a large, drafty bay window that overlooked the churning, steel-gray waters of the Columbia River. Outside, the sky was already bruising into a deep, violent purple. A massive Pacific gale was aggressively pushing its way onto the coastline, bringing with it a sudden, freezing drop in the barometric pressure. We dropped our luggage near the foot of the beds, and I immediately sought out the attached bathroom to wash the exhaustion of the drive from my face. The bathroom was a windowless, entirely tiled space, freezing cold and overwhelmingly silent. I pulled the heavy wooden door shut and reached for the antique brass privacy lock. The exact moment the metal mechanism clicked into place, I felt a sudden, razor-sharp laceration slice deeply across the pad of my index finger. The pain was immediate and blinding, a deep, burning sting that felt entirely deliberate. I pulled my hand back in pure shock, staring down at a deep, incredibly clean cut that was immediately welling with thick, dark blood. But the detail that sent a freezing chill directly down my spine was the physical impossibility of the environment. Despite the depth of the wound and the rapid pooling of blood on my skin, not a single solitary drop ever touched the pristine white tiles of the floor. It was as if the physical space refused to allow the evidence of the injury to exist. I meticulously examined the smooth brass lock, finding absolutely no jagged edges, no exposed screws, nothing that could have possibly caused such a violent surgical slice. It did not feel like a careless accident. It felt like a deliberate, hostile warning. I wrapped my hand in a thick towel, returning to the main room to silently show my husband and my sister. We attempted to rationalize it, blaming the unfamiliar antique hardware, but the unease had already firmly rooted itself in my stomach. I knelt on the floor to unpack my belongings, reaching for the heavy combination lock securing my suitcase. I had used the exact same numerical sequence for over a decade, muscle memory turning the dials without a conscious thought. I pulled the release mechanism, but the lock remained completely, stubbornly dead. I reset the dials, carefully aligning the numbers again and again, but the internal mechanism refused to yield. It was as if the lock had been fundamentally altered the moment it entered the room. The frustration quickly mutated into a creeping sense of dread. I was ultimately forced to violently pull the zippers off their tracks to access my clothing, muttering under my breath that whatever was occupying this room needed to stop testing our patience. My husband simply watched me in silence. He has always possessed an unfortunate, heavy sensitivity to the unseen world. A quiet intuition that recognizes when an environment is actively hostile. He did not offer any empty reassurances. He simply agreed with my sister's anxious request that we leave the heavy brass bedside lamps burning for the entirety of the night. We lay awake for hours, listening to the violent coastal storm battering the bay windows. Even with the ambient light filling the room, the overwhelming magnetic sensation of being intently observed from the darkest corners of the ceiling was entirely suffocating. The following morning, the storm had not relented. The sky remained a bruised, impenetrable gray. I stepped into the freezing bathroom to shower, turning my back to the heavy clawfoot tub as I adjusted the towels. When I turned back around, I froze entirely. There was a stark, brilliant crimson stain smeared across the pristine white porcelain of the floor, directly beneath the shower head. My immediate, rational thought was that the bandage on my finger had somehow leaked, but my hand was completely dry and fully wrapped. The stain was vibrant, fresh, and undeniably blood. Before my mind could even begin to process the horrific implication of the stain, the heavy, cross-shaped metal handle of the sink basin directly behind me began to turn. It was a slow, deliberate, and agonizingly heavy rotation, followed instantly by the violent rush of freezing water plunging into the porcelain bowl. I was standing entirely alone in the center of the room, my back to the sink, my eyes locked onto the blood on the floor. The atmospheric pressure in the small, tiled room dropped so aggressively that my eardrums throbbed. I could feel an immense, freezing mass standing directly behind my shoulder, waiting patiently for me to turn around, waiting for me to acknowledge its physical presence. I clamped my eyes shut, silently repeating to myself over and over again to absolutely refuse the interaction. I blindly reached backward, aggressively forcing the metal handle into the off position, and walked out of the bathroom without ever looking behind me. We spent the entirety of the day deliberately avoiding the hotel, wandering the rain-soaked streets of Astoria until exhaustion physically forced us to return to our suite late in the evening. At precisely 2:30 in the morning, the true, unadulterated horror of the hotel finally manifested. I was violently pulled from a deep sleep by a sound that defied all logic and reason. It was not echoing through the air of the room. It was vibrating deeply through the wooden floorboards, traveling up through the heavy wooden bed frame, and resonating directly inside the feathers of my pillow. It was the sound of weeping. But it was not a human expression of sorrow. It was a deep, guttural, and profoundly unholy sobbing, coming directly through the wall from the adjacent, entirely vacant suite. The sheer volume of the despair was paralyzing, radiating a pure, concentrated malice that made the hair on my arms stand entirely on end. I lay completely rigid beneath the heavy blankets, entirely unable to move. I looked toward the center bed. My husband was already awake, his eyes wide and fixed blindly on the ceiling, his breathing shallow and erratic. He communicated without speaking, silently confirming that he was enduring the exact same auditory nightmare. I desperately attempted to rationalize the noise, praying that the ancient architecture was simply amplifying the sounds of a neighboring guest. But then, my husband's expression shifted from fear into absolute, unadulterated terror. He slowly pulled the heavy blankets tightly against his chest, his body trembling violently. He conveyed to me, through sheer panic, that the entity was no longer confined to the adjacent room. He could physically feel the distinct, freezing pressure of elongated hands slowly dragging themselves across his ankles, sliding methodically up his calves beneath the sheets. The weeping was no longer muffled by the plaster walls. It was inside the room with us. My husband's eyes slowly tracked downward, locking onto the absolute foot of his bed. He was paralyzed by the sight of a towering, impossibly dense silhouette, composed entirely of absolute, suffocating darkness. The figure of a weeping woman standing perfectly still in the ambient light of the bedside lamps, radiating a cold, predatory sorrow that physically compressed the oxygen in the room. The unholy sobbing continued relentlessly, an agonizing loop of despair that lasted for what felt like endless, tormenting hours, until sheer physical exhaustion finally forced our bodies into a defensive, dreamless unconsciousness. The very next morning, we gathered our belongings in absolute, terrified silence. We did not speak a single word of the night's events while inside those walls, terrified that acknowledging the trauma would somehow tether the entity to us. Before stepping out into the hallway, I returned to the bathroom one final time. The crimson stain remained perfectly intact on the floor. I turned the faucet, allowing the water to wash the blood down the drain, watching it swirl and vanish into the ancient plumbing, silently confirming that what we had endured was undeniably real. We fled the Oregon coast that very morning, abandoning the remainder of our itinerary. It was only when we were hundreds of miles away, safely surrounded by the comforting noise of a crowded diner, that my husband finally found the courage to speak. He explained the terrifying reality of his sensitivity, confirming the towering, weeping shadow that had stood at the foot of his bed. He left me with a profoundly chilling realization that has permanently altered how I navigate the world. He explained that you must never, under any circumstances, allow yourself to acknowledge the unseen world when you are exhausted or vulnerable. Because the exact moment you open your mind to look back at them in the dark, they realize you can see them, and that is precisely when they decide to reach out and touch you. There is a specific, terrifying vulnerability that comes with sitting at the edge of a massive body of dark water in the absolute dead of night. The darkness hovering over a deep lake does not merely exist, it consumes. It creates a perfect, impenetrable void where the natural laws of the physical world seem to quietly unravel. A few summers ago, two close acquaintances and I rented an isolated, rustic cabin nestled deeply within the dense, ancient pines of the Adirondack Mountains, specifically along the remote northern shores of Lake George in upstate New York. We were desperately seeking a brief reprieve from the suffocating pressure of our daily lives, hoping to find solace in the profound isolation of the wilderness. The property was remarkably secluded, sitting at the very end of a winding, unpaved logging road. It possessed a small, private stretch of rocky shoreline and an aging wooden dock that extended out into the black water. On our final evening, we decided to build a small fire in the stone pit situated just a few yards from the edge of the lake. The hour had pushed deep into the early morning, somewhere suspended between 3 and 4. The night was uncharacteristically warm and entirely stagnant. The surface of the massive lake was completely undisturbed, resembling a sheet of perfectly polished obsidian. The heavy silence of the mountain air was absolute, devoid of even the slightest movement of nocturnal wildlife. We were simply sitting in the fading amber glow of the dying embers, entirely lost in our own exhaustion, when my attention was inexplicably drawn away from the fire and toward the dense tree line bordering the gravel driveway. Standing perfectly still, just at the edge of the shadows, was the silhouette of an unnaturally tall man. He was dressed entirely in a pristine, impeccably tailored black suit. The attire was immediately, profoundly jarring, completely alien to the rugged, humid environment of a mountain lake in the middle of summer. My initial, desperate attempt at rationalization was to assume he was simply a lost traveler, perhaps a guest from a distant, upscale resort who had somehow wandered miles off the main road in the dark. I did not alert my companions immediately. I simply watched him, waiting for him to indicate his purpose. Then, he began to move toward us. His method of locomotion was deeply, terrifyingly unnatural. He did not possess the organic, rhythmic sway of a human being navigating uneven, rocky terrain. His posture remained impossibly, painfully rigid, his arms pinned tightly to his sides. He seemed to glide smoothly over the gravel and the exposed tree roots, moving with a terrifying, continuous velocity that entirely defied the physical obstacles of the shoreline. My body registered the profound danger long before my conscious mind could fully comprehend it. A heavy, sickening wave of pure, instinctual dread violently flooded my nervous system. My companions finally noticed my paralyzed gaze and turned their heads toward the approaching figure, and I watched the exact same suffocating terror instantly wash over their features. We remained completely frozen in our chairs, our respiratory systems entirely locked, as the man in the black suit came to an abrupt, mechanically precise halt mere feet from the edge of the fire pit. He did not offer a greeting. He did not request assistance. He simply stood there in the faint, flickering light of the embers and stared down at the three of us. The absolute horror of his face is permanently seared into the deepest recesses of my memory. His features were elongated, completely devoid of any natural human symmetry. But the most catastrophic element of his visage, the detail that shattered any remaining illusion that we were looking at a living human being, was his smile. It was a wide, impossible, and completely unblinking grin that stretched entirely too far across his pale face, exposing a multitude of perfectly uniform teeth. It was not an expression of joy or amusement. It was a terrifyingly artificial mimicry of a human emotion, a predatory mask worn by something entirely alien attempting to blend into our reality. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and completely devoid of any recognizable soul or intelligence. They were flat, black voids that radiated a cold, calculating, and immeasurable malice. The sheer density of the atmospheric pressure radiating from him was agonizing. It felt as though gravity itself had doubled in his presence, pinning us to our seats and aggressively crushing the oxygen from our lungs. The silence between us stretched into an eternity of pure, unadulterated psychological torture. My mind was screaming, desperately attempting to process the uncanny valley of his existence, the horrifying realization that we were entirely isolated in the darkness with an apex predator that did not belong to this earth. I engaged in an involuntary, incredibly foolish trauma response. My facial muscles twitched, and I offered a weak, trembling mimicry of a smile in return, an instinctual, desperate attempt to appease the entity. For a fraction of a second, the unnatural width of his grin seemed to falter, the artificial mask slipping just enough to reveal a bottomless well of ancient hostility beneath. Without a single preceding movement or shift in his weight, he turned his rigid body away from us. He did not retreat toward the safety of the driveway or the dense pines. Instead, he resumed his impossible, gliding march directly toward the edge of the rocky shoreline. We remained completely paralyzed, watching in absolute, stunned silence as the tall man in the pristine black suit walked straight into the freezing black waters of Lake George. He did not hesitate. He did not attempt to swim or break his agonizingly stiff posture. He simply continued his march down into the depths, the dark water slowly rising over his knees, his waist, his shoulders, until the obsidian surface of the lake completely swallowed his grinning face. The water rippled for only a brief moment before returning to a state of perfect, undisturbed glass. The crushing, atmospheric weight instantly evaporated from the shoreline. We did not wait to confirm his disappearance. We simultaneously abandoned our chairs, sprinting blindly up the wooden stairs and throwing ourselves into the locked safety of the cabin. We barricaded the heavy wooden door, entirely unwilling to look out the windows facing the lake for the remainder of the agonizingly long night. The traumatic aftermath of that encounter forced me into a deep, obsessive search for answers. I spent countless hours scouring obscure archives and regional folklore, desperately seeking any rational explanation for the impossible entity we had witnessed. It was during this manic research that I discovered the deeply unsettling historical accounts of the Grinning Man, a bizarre, heavily documented phenomenon that stretches across multiple decades and various isolated regions of the United States. Accounts of impossibly tall figures in outdated suits, possessing artificial, terrifying smiles, entirely lacking human mannerisms, and consistently appearing near deep bodies of water or isolated stretches of highway. The revelation brought me absolutely no comfort. It only cemented the horrifying reality that our experience was not a localized hallucination. I have permanently severed my connection to the wilderness. I will never again seek out the profound isolation of a mountain lake, because I now possess the terrifying, undeniable knowledge that the darkness does not only hide natural predators, it hides ancient, unnatural things that wear our shape. Things that stand in the freezing water, patiently waiting in the dark with a wide, impossible smile. The arrogance of youth often blinds us to the deeply unsettling realities of the places we choose to inhabit. We accept positions of employment based entirely on convenience and a paycheck, entirely ignoring the suffocating history that might be trapped within the foundation of the architecture. Several years ago, I found myself desperately needing a quiet, nocturnal routine to escape the overwhelming chaos of my personal life. I applied for the night audit position at the majestic, deeply imposing Crescent Hotel, perched high above the mist-choked Victorian mountain town of Eureka Springs, Arkansas. The hiring process should have been my very first undeniable warning that something was fundamentally wrong with the establishment. I walked into the grand lobby on a random Tuesday afternoon, entirely unannounced, only to find the front desk completely abandoned. The previous night staff had walked out simultaneously, leaving their heavy name tags and neatly folded uniforms perfectly aligned on the mahogany counter. The frantic management team hired me on the absolute spot, out of sheer, desperate necessity. They did not question my lack of experience. They only cared that I was willing to sit alone in the dark. During my brief, incredibly rushed orientation, I was entirely unaware of the building's notorious reputation. No one in management pulled me aside to warn me about the crushing atmosphere, or the heavy, unspoken history that clung to the plaster walls. The horrific truth was only revealed to me by an elderly housekeeper during a tour of the subterranean levels. She led me down into the freezing limestone basement to show me the overflow storage, and casually began to dismantle my fragile sense of security. She explained that the sprawling, glamorous hotel had not always been a place of luxury. During the late 1930s, the entire building had been purchased by a notorious medical charlatan and converted into a fraudulent cancer hospital. A deeply tragic place where desperate individuals were brought under the false promise of a miraculous cure, only to be subjected to agonizing experimental treatments. She pointed to the very room where we now stored extra linens and industrial cleaning supplies, her expression entirely devoid of emotion. She explained that this exact, freezing, windowless cavern had once served as the hospital's makeshift morgue and the clandestine autopsy theater, where countless individuals drew their final, agonizing breaths in absolute isolation. I stood there, in the dim, flickering light of the basement, a delayed, suffocating jolt of pure panic slowly radiating through my nervous system. I was suddenly, terrifyingly aware that my desk was positioned directly above a space where the dead used to be stacked and forgotten. I desperately attempted to utilize logic to suppress my escalating dread, convincing myself that history was merely history, and that the lingering tragedies of the past could not physically harm me in the present. But as the bitter, freezing Arkansas winter descended upon the mountains, the tourist season completely died. The sprawling, cavernous hotel emptied out almost entirely, leaving only myself and a single, silent security guard to patrol the endless, suffocating corridors. It is only when a massive, historic building is entirely devoid of the living that you finally notice the terrifying movements of the unseen. The manifestations began as subtle, localized anomalies that I desperately tried to ignore. I would be standing alone behind the front desk, and I would catch the distinct, fluid movement of a tall, unnatural shadow, detaching itself from the Victorian furniture in my extreme peripheral vision. But the exact moment I turned my head to confront it, the space would be entirely empty, leaving only the heavy, oppressive sensation that I was being intently, maliciously studied. Then, the physical environment began to aggressively manipulate itself. While walking the long, carpeted hallways on the upper floors, I would frequently experience the sudden, violent displacement of air brushing aggressively past my shoulder. It possessed the undeniable, heavy physical force of a large man sprinting down the corridor in a blind panic. But the hallway was always completely, terrifyingly vacant. The air would simply swirl and settle, carrying the faint, sterile scent of ancient medical alcohol. The internal communication radios were entirely compromised. Instead of emitting the expected, mundane static of a dead channel, the frequency would frequently open on its own, broadcasting a deep, suffocatingly wet respiration, the agonizing physical struggle of lungs desperately fighting for oxygen. It was a projection of pure medical agony that belonged to no one on the payroll, and the security guard and I would simply stare at the device in paralyzing, absolute silence, entirely unwilling to acknowledge the horror we were sharing. The deep isolation began to violently affect the very few guests who dared to brave the off-season. Late one evening, a young couple bolted down the grand wooden staircase, entirely abandoning their luggage in their suite. Their faces were completely drained of color, their bodies trembling with severe physiological shock. They communicated through sheer, breathless panic that they had entered the antique wrought iron elevator on the 4th floor. As the carriage began to descend, an invisible, freezing mass had violently manifested inside the confined space with them, pressing heavily against their chests and aggressively stealing the oxygen from their lungs. They described the distinct, undeniable sensation of a third, unseen presence trapping them in the dark, radiating an intense, predatory desperation. On another night, a woman approached the front desk at 3 a.m, her eyes wide with a primal, unadulterated terror. She refused to return to her suite, silently conveying the horrifying realization that the man currently sleeping in her bed was no longer her husband. She expressed a deep, terrifying certainty that his entire personality had been forcefully suppressed, replaced by an ancient, calculating malice that was merely wearing his physical form. I tried to dismiss these events as collective hysteria, fueled by the Gothic architecture, until the night I was forced to confront the unseen reality myself. I was taking my mandatory break down in the freezing limestone basement, sitting entirely alone in the suffocating silence of the old morgue, attempting to find a moment of peace away from the expansive emptiness of the upper floors. Without any preliminary warning, the atmospheric pressure in the subterranean room plummeted so violently that my eardrums throbbed with a sharp, agonizing pain. The ambient temperature instantly dropped below freezing. I sat perfectly still, my respiratory system completely frozen, waiting for the inevitable. From the absolute opposite end of the dark, cavernous room, a heavy, solid oak chair was violently, aggressively hurled across the empty space. It did not merely slide or fall. It was forcefully propelled through the air with a terrifying, undeniable velocity. It missed my head by mere inches, carrying the distinct, malicious intent to cause severe physical trauma, before violently colliding with the thick stone wall behind me and splintering into pieces. I did not attempt to investigate. I did not wait for the unseen entity to prepare a second assault. My brain simply could not process the horrifying reality of an invisible, physical attack. I abandoned my belongings in the break room, sprinted up the subterranean stairs, and walked out of the heavy glass doors into the freezing mountain night. I left my uniform neatly folded on the mahogany front desk, and I never returned to collect my final paycheck, because I had finally realized the horrifying truth. The fraudulent hospital had never truly closed. Its agonizing patients had simply become the permanent, deeply hostile residents of the unseen world, and they possessed absolutely no desire to be disturbed by the living. There is a profound, almost intoxicating allure to the absolute edge of the continent. We often romanticize the concept of retreating to the sea, believing that the vast, open expanse of the ocean will somehow absorb our anxieties and offer a quiet, undisturbed sanctuary. But the Pacific Northwest coastline is not a peaceful environment. It is an ancient, violent landscape where the dense, suffocating rainforest abruptly collides with a freezing, unforgiving ocean. Late last autumn, two close colleagues and I decided to rent an incredibly isolated, brutalist-style cabin perched precariously on a jagged sea cliff near the remote tip of the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state. We were desperately seeking a total disconnection from our demanding careers, deliberately choosing a property that was miles away from any paved roads, cellular service, or neighboring homes. The cabin itself was a striking, imposing structure of poured concrete and massive floor-to-ceiling windows designed to offer uninterrupted views of the churning gray water. But despite the modern architecture, the interior possessed a heavy, stagnant atmosphere. It felt entirely disconnected from the natural world outside, as if the building was holding its breath. The layout was relatively straightforward. Two main bedrooms occupied the upper loft, while the ground floor consisted of a sprawling, open-plan living space and a long, narrow hallway leading to a utility room. There was one specific door in that hallway that was heavily padlocked from the outside. The rental listing had explicitly stated it was an owner's storage closet and strictly off-limits. Because I have always preferred the ambient light of the morning, I volunteered to sleep on the expansive, modular sofa in the main living area, leaving the isolated bedrooms to my colleagues. The unsettling phenomena did not begin with dramatic, theatrical manifestations. They began as subtle, environmental impossibilities that our exhausted minds desperately attempted to rationalize. During our very first night, long after the violent coastal winds had masked any natural sounds of the forest, I lay awake in the absolute darkness of the living room. Suddenly, I felt a deep, rhythmic vibration radiating through the concrete foundation of the cabin. It was an incredibly slow, deliberate, and methodical displacement of the earth. It possessed the heavy, synchronized cadence of a massive, unseen procession marching through the dense, ancient pine forest inland, moving directly toward the edge of the cliff. I could physically feel the heavy, concussive pressure traveling through the floorboards and vibrating against my spine. I remained perfectly still, my respiratory system entirely paralyzed, tracking the invisible, rhythmic pressure as it slowly passed by the exterior walls of the cabin and faded into the direction of the sea. I convinced myself it was merely a localized seismic event, a natural anomaly common to the unstable coastal cliffs. But the following night, the true suffocating nature of the house revealed itself. I awoke in the deepest hours of the morning to an intense, unnatural drop in the ambient temperature of the living space. I sat upright in the dark, pulling the heavy wool blanket tightly against my chest, and my eyes immediately locked onto the narrow hallway leading to the locked utility door. A brilliant, agonizingly cold luminescence was spilling out from beneath the thick wooden frame of the locked door. It was not the warm, familiar glow of an electrical bulb. It was a pale, sickly, and vibrating light that seemed to actively consume the shadows around it. I knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that there were no windows in that storage space. During the daylight hours, the gap beneath the door revealed nothing but an impenetrable, pitch-black void. Yet, every single night for the remainder of our stay, the exact moment the clock slipped past 3 a.m, that locked room would ignite with that silent, freezing luminescence. I never witnessed the light turn on, and I never witnessed it fade. I would simply open my eyes, and the gap beneath the heavy door would already be glowing, radiating a silent, predatory energy that kept me entirely paralyzed on the sofa until dawn. I did not mention the light to my colleagues, unwilling to introduce my paranoia into their peaceful retreat. But on the morning of our final full day, the unspoken tension in the cabin finally fractured. We were sitting on the concrete patio, staring out at the violent gray ocean, when one of my colleagues quietly confessed that the isolation was severely affecting his nerves. He explained that during the previous night, he had felt the exact same heavy, rhythmic vibration that I had experienced, but it was not coming from the forest outside. He described the horrifying physical sensation of an invisible, concussive rhythm isolated entirely within the corner of his locked bedroom. A slow, methodical, and suffocating pressure that vibrated through the floorboards mere feet from his bed, pacing endlessly in the dark. Our other colleague remained completely silent, staring blankly at the wooden table. Before either of us could offer a hollow reassurance, he slowly reached up and pulled the collar of his heavy sweater down to expose his shoulder and the back of his neck. Carved deeply into his skin were 4 perfectly parallel, agonizingly sharp lacerations. They were vicious, burning lines that looked entirely fresh, trailing aggressively down his shoulder blade. He explained, his voice entirely devoid of emotion, that he had awakened in the middle of the night to a crushing, freezing weight pressing his chest into the mattress, entirely paralyzing his limbs, followed by the slow, agonizing friction of an invisible hand deliberately dragging its nails down his back. The sheer physical evidence of the attack completely shattered any remaining illusions of a peaceful retreat. We were entirely isolated in a hostile, predatory environment that was actively hunting us in our sleep. We immediately agreed to abandon the cabin. We spent our final evening huddled together in the main living space, all the lights burning brightly, refusing to sleep, refusing to look down the hallway toward the locked door. As the sun finally began to rise over the ancient pines, we hurriedly gathered our belongings in complete, terrified silence. But the most catastrophic element of the entire ordeal, the detail that fundamentally broke my understanding of the physical world, occurred just as we were loading our bags into the vehicle. My colleague casually adjusted the strap of his duffel bag, wincing in anticipation of the pain from the lacerations on his shoulder. I looked at his exposed neck, and the skin was perfectly, flawlessly clear. The 4 deep, burning scratches had completely vanished. There was no scarring, no lingering redness, no physical evidence whatsoever that the violent attack had ever occurred. It was as if the unseen entity had deliberately reabsorbed the physical trauma, leaving behind nothing but the permanent psychological scar of the experience. We drove away from the jagged sea cliffs without speaking a single word. I will never return to the absolute edge of the continent, and I will never again trust a locked door in an empty house. Because I now understand that some places do not merely shelter you from the elements, they isolate you from the protection of the natural world. And they quietly, methodically, feed on your isolation until you are finally allowed to leave. There is a unique, profound type of isolation that exists only in the high altitudes of the American West. It is a vast, crushing emptiness where the landscape is so overwhelmingly massive that human existence feels entirely insignificant. We had intentionally sought out this exact type of geographical isolation, desperately needing a sanctuary to repair our exhausted minds. My partner and I had meticulously planned a week-long retreat, securing a reservation at a sprawling, independent timber lodge nestled deeply within the shadow of the Wind River Range in Wyoming. It was a colossal structure, entirely disconnected from the nearest highway by miles of winding, unpaved forest roads. We had arranged for an unusually early arrival, securing confirmation weeks in advance to ensure our transition into the wilderness would be entirely seamless. We arrived at the property just as the morning sun was attempting to burn through a thick layer of freezing mountain fog. The immediate, instinctual reaction I experienced upon viewing the lodge was not relief. It was a heavy, sinking sensation of profound wrongness. The property was massive, capable of housing dozens of guests, yet the expansive gravel parking lot was completely and terrifyingly empty. Aside from a single, rusted maintenance vehicle parked near the tree line, we approached the heavy wooden entrance, and the proprietor who greeted us did not display the expected warmth of the hospitality industry. His posture was entirely rigid, his expression completely vacant. He stared at us with an unsettling, unblinking intensity, silently conveying absolute confusion regarding our presence. When my partner presented the written confirmation of our early arrival, the proprietor simply stared at the paper, as if the concept of time and scheduling was entirely alien to him. He eventually allowed us inside, engaging in an agonizingly slow, methodical process of securing our reservation. It was during this suffocating wait that the first physical manifestation of the anomaly occurred. I happened to glance out through the massive glass windows of the lobby, peering back toward the freezing, empty parking lot. Standing entirely alone in the bitter cold was a woman. She was dressed in incredibly thin, inadequate athletic clothing, completely unsuited for the freezing mountain temperatures. She was not moving. She was not exercising. She was simply standing perfectly still on the gravel, staring directly through the glass at us with a wide, impossible, and entirely artificial smile. It was a predatory expression, a horrifying mimicry of human joy that completely lacked any warmth or soul. I immediately turned my attention back to the interior of the lobby, desperately attempting to ignore the crushing weight of her gaze. And that was exactly when my partner violently gripped my arm. He silently directed my attention toward the far end of the cavernous room. A remarkably tall man was walking slowly across the polished wooden floorboards, moving with a stiff, unnatural cadence. I blinked, merely breaking visual contact for a fraction of a second. And when my eyelids opened, the expansive space was completely empty. The man had entirely vanished, leaving absolutely no physical trace or disturbance in the air. The proprietor finally handed us a heavy brass key, assigning us a suite located at the absolute furthest corner of the ground floor. The room itself immediately amplified my escalating paranoia. It was incredibly dark, entirely lacking the expansive mountain views promised in the promotional materials. But the most terrifying detail was the structural modification of the main door. The heavy brass deadbolt had been deliberately and violently removed, leaving behind deep, splintered gouges in the wood. We were completely stripped of any internal security. The suite possessed a secondary exit, a heavy glass door leading out onto a shared wooden balcony that overlooked the isolated tree line. My partner immediately secured the latch, silently agreeing that the atmosphere of the property was deeply, inexplicably hostile. Desperate to escape the crushing stagnation of the room, we decided to hike one of the remote trails bordering the property, hoping the freezing air would reset our escalating panic. The forest was entirely devoid of wildlife, existing in a state of absolute, unnatural suspension. We were navigating a narrow dirt path when a young man suddenly emerged from the dense pines. He did not possess the typical demeanor of a hiker. His movements were incredibly fluid, and his eyes were entirely vacant. He fell into step beside us, engaging in a relentless, probing interrogation regarding our identities and our exact location within the lodge. His inquiries were not born of polite curiosity. They possessed a dark, calculating, and deeply aggressive intent. My partner masterfully deflected every single invasive question, but the young man refused to relent, repeatedly demanding our room number with a chilling, synchronized persistence. The interaction felt entirely predatory, like an apex hunter attempting to isolate a weakness in its prey. We abruptly altered our trajectory, practically sprinting back toward the suffocating safety of the lodge. The exact moment we secured the damaged door of our suite behind us, the terrifying reality of our situation escalated from an atmospheric dread into a physical assault. The heavy adjoining door that connected our room to the adjacent, supposedly vacant suite began to violently shake. It was an aggressive, catastrophic physical vibration, as if an immense, unseen mass was throwing its entire weight against the timber, desperately attempting to force the lock. My partner lunged across the room, forcefully throwing his shoulder against the wood to keep it secured. The violent agitation abruptly ceased. My partner slowly, cautiously turned the handle, pulling the door open to reveal a hollow-eyed, incredibly frail woman standing in the dim light of the adjacent room. Her expression was entirely devoid of emotion. She offered a rapid, completely nonsensical explanation regarding the maintenance of the locks, her voice lacking any inflection or genuine apology. She simply turned and dissolved into the shadows of the empty room. The timing was entirely impossible. The sheer physical force required to shake the door to that degree could never have been produced by someone of her fragile stature. The realization that we were actively being hunted by whatever was occupying the building finally broke our paralysis. We immediately began frantically throwing our belongings into our bags, entirely abandoning any pretense of a vacation. My partner rushed toward the glass balcony door, intending to open it to equalize the suffocating pressure in the room. He gripped the handle and pulled, but the heavy glass completely refused to yield. The latch had been mechanically, forcefully jammed from the exterior. The door that had functioned perfectly mere hours ago was now a permanent, impenetrable barrier. We were deliberately, methodically being penned into the room. As we rushed to gather the final pieces of our luggage, my partner's foot caught the edge of a heavy woven rug positioned entirely beneath the bed frame. The fabric folded back, revealing the final, catastrophic horror of the suite. Built directly into the floorboards, completely hidden from view, was a square, wooden hatch. My partner knelt and pressed his knuckles against the wood. The resulting resonance revealed a deep, cavernous, and entirely hollow space existing directly beneath our mattress. We were sleeping directly on top of a subterranean access point, completely vulnerable to whatever was moving in the dark beneath the foundation of the building. We did not investigate the hatch. We abandoned the remainder of our belongings, threw our bags over our shoulders, and bolted into the dim, freezing hallway. The escape to the vehicle was a blur of pure, unadulterated terror. The few individuals we encountered on our desperate sprint to the parking lot, the maintenance worker, a woman standing in the lobby, the proprietor behind the desk, all entirely ceased their movements. They simply stopped, turning their heads in perfect, horrifying synchronization, and stared at us with empty, vacant eyes and wide artificial smiles. They did not attempt to physically restrain us. They simply watched us flee, projecting a massive, suffocating wave of synchronized malice that burned against my spine until we finally threw ourselves into the vehicle and tore out onto the unpaved mountain road. We drove for hundreds of miles in absolute traumatized silence, entirely refusing to look in the rearview mirror. I do not know if the lodge was a coordinated trap operated by deeply disturbed individuals, or if the isolated timber structure had simply become a hunting ground for things that merely wear the shape of humanity. But I am permanently, terrifyingly certain that if we had remained in that room until the sun finally set, the hatch beneath the bed would have inevitably opened.